I'd like to welcome you tonight on behalf of the Center of the Faculty of Communication and Design and also the Ryerson University. This evening's panel is the 12th in the series of events that the Center is putting on this academic year related to issues of freedom of expression and the public's right to know. To see podcasts of any of our previous events, you can just go to our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. They're all available there, as well as a lot of other hopefully interesting information about freedom of expression and the public's right to know. If you'd like to receive notices about any of the Center's events, we're going to have another dozen or so in the coming 12 months. You can just sign up. Ange Holmes, who's the director, as the Center's coordinator, we'll pass them around. So if you'd like to just be on the email list to receive notices, just put your name and email address on that, and we'll make sure you receive it. The presentation tonight is being live streamed and will be also on our website in a couple days. Our subject tonight is surveillance. Now, if there's anyone in Canada or the United States who was unaware of the public importance of this issue, certainly Edward Snowden's revelations would have helped remedy their misperceptions. Snowden's documents have proven, as many of you know, a goldmine of information about how we are being watched and in ways that many of us never imagined. Our keynote speaker tonight will look at privacy, the role of telecommunications providers, key surveillance programs, and introduce the Snowden Archive-in-a-Box, which you might see sitting next to our keynote speaker. That allows research on the Snowden material without being surveilled. He will examine the current state of surveillance research and reform movements in Canada and make some proposals for their future. Two important experts on surveillance will be discussants following the initial presentation. Our keynote speaker is Evan Light, sitting beside me here. Dr. Light is an assistant professor in the School of Translation at Glendon College at York University, member of the Algorithmic Media Observatory on the Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur l'Information, la Communication et la Société. He does research on privacy and surveillance, communications policy, community media, social movements, and communications infrastructure. His original research and translations have appeared in a number of academic journals, including Big Data and Society, the Journal of Peer Production, the Canadian Journal of Communication, the South African Journal for Communication Theory and Research, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, and the Journal of Latin American Communication Research, amongst others. Quite a diverse set of places his work has appeared. Following Evan's talk, Brenda McPhail and Andrew Clement will share some observations with you. Dr. McPhail, sitting at the far end, is director of the Civil Liberties Association Privacy, Surveillance, and Technology Project. Her recent work includes several things. One is guiding the Canadian Civil Liberties Association's interventions in key court cases that raise privacy issues, and also undertaking research into surveillance of dissent, government infrastructure, government information sharing, digital surveillance capabilities, and privacy in relation to emergent technologies, and also developing resources and presentations to drive public awareness about the importance of privacy as a social good. Brenda received her PhD from the University of Toronto Faculty of Information in 2013. Her peer-reviewed published work in her peer-reviewed and published work and at international conferences, she has explored do-it-yourself approaches through privacy protection, such as protecting privacy risks associated with RFID, enhanced driver's license, identity, performance in government service interactions, Canadian e-passport development, attitudes toward video surveillance, and privacy issues inherent in connected cars, and usage-based insurance. Many different things. Our second discussant is Andrew Clement. Andrew is a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Information Studies and Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, where he coordinates the Information Policy Research Program and co-founded the Identity, Privacy, and Security Institute. With a PhD in computer science, he has had long-standing research and teaching interests in the social implications of information communication technologies and participatory design. Amongst his recent privacy surveillance research projects are the Snowden Archives, which I hopefully most of you know about, an online searchable collection of all the documents leaked by Edward Snowden that have subsequently been published in news media. The second one is called Seeing Through the Cloud, which examined extranational outsourcing of e-communication services, especially by universities. Another one is IXMaps, IXMaps.ca, an internet mapping tool that helps make more visible NSA warrantless wiretapping activities and the routing of Canadian personal data through the US, even when the origin and the destination are both in Canada. And surveillancerights.ca, which documents non-compliance of video surveillance installations with privacy regulations and helps citizens understand their related privacy rights. So quite a remarkable collection of initiatives that Andrew has taken, hopefully we'll tell you a little bit about tonight. So I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our speaker and our discussants, and then I'll turn it over to Evan to give his opening remarks.
Having me here tonight. This is actually my first public talk in Toronto, having moved here just this past summer to start a new communications program at the Glendon campus of York, the bilingual campus of York, with a couple colleagues in the audience. Before I get into the talk, if you have a device on you, a phone or a laptop, you'll see a Wi-Fi hotspot in this room called Snowden Archive. And if you want to connect to it and go to any website, I suggest you go to nsa.gov. You'll wind up inside that box there. This is the Snowden Archive-in-a-Box. It's an offline version of the archive that Andrew helped build up of the Edward Snowden documents, or at least those that are publicly available. Something I'll get into in a bit. But for now, if you want to connect to it, feel free to. Whatever device you have, you'll see Snowden Archive as a Wi-Fi hotspot. Connect to it and go to nsa.gov. And in reality, you'll wind up in that little box. And nowhere else. Which is important for anybody who's ever had any sort of private communications online, or if you've been labeled or self-identify as an artist or politician or an activist, or if you've ever thought about sex or talked about drugs or done research on drugs. All these things are things that you might want to, in some way, not want everyone in the world to know about, or people who you don't know to know about. It used to be that years ago, in the years of telegraph, that we entrusted people like this guy with our information. We told them the message that we wanted to communicate over wires or over radio waves, and they turned it into codes and passed it along, either as Morse code, either through radio waves or through wires. But there was this sort of cast of people that we entrusted with our information. And I imagine they took it seriously. Later, when telephones came into operation, we entrusted telephone operators with it, and they were, again, actual human beings who were entrusted with making these physical links between other humans, who could potentially listen in on phone calls, and they would know who was talking to whom, but they were entrusted with this knowledge. And there was an understanding that they wouldn't be handing it over to anybody else. This is all done in the name of privacy, which is not just an abstract concept, but if we look at the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, privacy, it's a fundamental human right. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his or her privacy, family, home, or correspondence. And this is a thing that's been debated quite a bit, especially in the last 5 years. Or since 2013 with the Snowden revelations about mass surveillance, which I'll explore a bit more thoroughly. And we can maybe get into in the discussion with Andrew and Brenda and all of you, what this right is and how it evolves and what we need in terms of technology, in terms of law, what are these other infrastructures that we need to be developed in a more complex way to be able to really enact the human right to privacy today. So is there anybody in this room that does not have one of these devices in their pocket or on their body today? You don't have one? Anybody else? So almost everybody here is being watched in some sort of way right now, because in the last 20 years or so, we've replaced the human beings that make the connections between us with these faceless corporations. Some of these you'll recognize: Rogers, TELUS, Videotron, Bell. A bunch of them are European. But they're corporations like this that we now entrust to make these connections between us, that we give our privileged information to. We don't necessarily agree to the contracts that we sign to understand how they treat our data, how they protect our privacy or not. But now there are these corporations with whom we have some really visceral connection. And this is more complex than you might think. If we look at, a couple years ago I was giving a talk in Europe and was looking at, okay, how am I connected to what's happening in Europe right now? And at the time I realized that Three, which was one of the big telecoms in Europe, was buying O2, one of I think the second or third largest telecom in the UK. And if you look at the chart, they were owned by Hutchison 3G UK Holdings Limited, which is owned by Hutchison Whampoa Limited, which was in reality owned by CK Hutchison Holdings Limited, which doesn't really mean that much, except that this whole sale was being funded by me at the time living in Montreal. It was being backed by the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board and the Caisse de dépôt et placement de Québec, the Quebec Pension Fund. So even though this transaction was happening in the UK, as somebody who's paying into pension plans in Canada and Quebec, I was not just indirectly, but somewhat directly funding this telecom consolidation happening in the UK. Something over which I didn't actually have any power. If we want to look a little closer, I'm a professor at York University. My pension plan is currently invested in Rogers, Shaw, TELUS, Cogeco, and BCE, all the big telecoms in Canada. Interestingly, Rogers, Shaw, and Cogeco have their shares set up so that nobody can actually gain any real voting power over the corporations. The majority votes are held by families. My pension also owns Nippon Telegraph and Telephone Company in Japan, NTT Docomo in Japan, and Smart One Telecommunications in Hong Kong. So a total of around $32.5 million of my pension is invested in telecom, which isn't a whole lot of money out of a $2 billion pension plan, but you would think that with this much money, my pension plan would have some sort of say over how things work. On a larger scale in the UK, all university teachers pay into one gigantic pension plan on a national scale, which currently has around £250 million invested in Vodafone. So to get back to surveillance, Jim mentioned Edward Snowden. Just to give you a brief recount, in 2003, Edward Snowden, now a former National Security Agency contractor, leaked what's estimated to be 1.5 million files of varying levels of top secret classification to a few journalists, documenting more or less a worldwide system of mass surveillance of more or less everybody, indiscriminate mass surveillance of the world's population. The documents, and if you feel like go looking at the documents as during the talk, from this archive or from the online archive, if you want to use the regular internet, you can go to snowdenarchive.cjfe.org, which is hosted by the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, also based here in Toronto. A lot of the documents get into some of the minute, or really tight relationships between what are known as the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes being an intelligence alliance of the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. It's been around since the 1940s. And this is important, we'll see, because different countries have different laws around how they can surveil their own populations. But in fact, all these countries share information back and forth. So if you can't surveil your own population, you can easily cooperate with somebody else who is doing it for you. To look at just what these resources are and what this system means a bit, in Canada we have a number of different I guess, formations of intelligence and policing agencies. One of the most, probably the most prevalent, most well-known is the RCMP. This is a brief outline of their mandate, but also their budget from last year and their projected budget for next year. So last year, we can see the RCMP had close to $3 billion of budget. Their oversight committee had about $1.5 million. CERC, which is the oversight committee of another intelligence agency we'll get into a bit, had close to $3 million. Next year, the RCMP's budget is projected to grow to somewhere around $3 million or $3 billion, and the review committee is supposed to have a decrease in funding. CSIS is our version of, I guess, the CIA, sort of our spies who do human intelligence out and around the world. This is, I guess, a brief comparison, chopped out because they basically because they follow in alphabetical order, but we can see at the CRTC, our communications regulator in Canada, who regulate telecom and broadcasting and have a huge job to do, last year had a budget of about $12 million, whereas our intelligence services had a budget of close to $600 million. And finally, we have CSEC, the Communications Security Establishment Canada, which is our version of the NSA, the National Security Agency in the US, which does mostly digital surveillance. If we follow their budget in 2014-15, when they built what's known as the most expensive building, or the most expensive buildings ever built in Canada, their new headquarters, which I think cost around 1.3 billion tax dollars to build. We started their budget roughly floating around close to $600 million a year, whereas their oversight commission has close to $2 million. So not much money, not much resources put into surveillance oversight. If we look at the website of the Office of the Communications Security Establishment Commissioner, they try and rationalize this a bit, and their discourse is really quite interesting. They say, well, you might think that we're under-resourced, but if you look around the world, if you look at Australia, New Zealand, the UK, you can count the number of people they have doing oversight on your hands. They have less people, they have less funding, and so we're doing it better than they are. So, but crap is still crap. To bring it a bit closer to Toronto, some of what CSIS, CSEC, the RCMP do, and in collaboration with other agencies around the world, is surveillance of politics. So some of you might remember the G8, G20. Maybe you were there. My first, I guess, glimpse of how this collaboration works was during the G8 and G20, or following it, when I learned that somebody I grew up with had gone on to work for the NSA as a mathematician. And he and his wife were in Toronto working out of the NSA headquarters, and I heard this through my mother, the NSA headquarters in Ottawa, which of course doesn't actually exist. I suppose it's the US Embassy. But they were stationed in Ottawa for a couple of years, and they were sent up to work with CSEC and CSIS on surveilling the G8 and G20. Slight aside, Greg Elmer, a professor here at Ryerson, has put together a really wonderful documentary, a bit about surveillance during the G8, G20 called Preempting Dissent, made with all found footage and contributed footage from people from around the world. To give you an idea of what kind of surveillance was happening at the G8, G20 here and the one at London, some details which are discerned out of documents that Snowden leaked. In London in 2009, the year preceding the one in Toronto, the GCHQ in the UK set up fake internet cafes for delegates to the G20 to use, whereby their traffic was immediately siphoned off for intelligence analysis. They were systematically observing and surveilling people's BlackBerries. BlackBerry, of course, being at the time known as the most secure telecommunications device you could use, and something that most diplomats would be using. They had 24/7 telephone surveillance that targeted diplomats' communications in various ways, email surveillance, and web browsing surveillance. But one of the biggest revelations from Snowden is that you don't have to be somebody important to be surveilled. Mass surveillance means that everybody is being watched more or less all the time, and that's what I'm going to get into in this part of the talk. The Snowden Digital Surveillance Archive set up by Andrew was really the first attempt in the world to try and systematically put these documents together in a way that people can not just access, but do research on, to be able to search terms, to be able to access the documents themselves in some systematic way. One of the downsides of this offline version right now is that the online version has links to all the original journalistic articles that published the documents to begin with. The future version, we're hoping will incorporate that in the offline one. But right now, if you go on the online version, you'll get access to all the original articles that explain and put in context what these documents are. I'll go through a few of the major surveillance programs, some that include Canada, some more internationally. But just to give you an idea of what it means that everybody's being surveilled, one of the first stories to break was a program called PRISM, which documents how the NSA, starting in 2007, following in 2013 when Snowden left the NSA, charts out how the NSA surveils more or less communications happening through Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple. And is there anybody in this room who, between 2007 and today, has not used any service owned by any of these corporations? Not since yesterday? To go a little more into detail, this is what this means, that they were able to access your email, video or voice chat, videos, photos, stored data, voice over IP, conversations, file transfers, video conferencing, social networking. And it wasn't just information taken directly from corporations. They figured out a system whereby they being the NSA in collaboration with other intelligence agencies around the world, which is not just the Five Eyes, as we'll see in a sec, set up systems whereby they collect information from the corporations directly, but also build in redundancy and have a system called Upstream, where they take the information out of the network itself by tapping fiber optic cables. One of the sort of less focused upon details of the cloud is that in reality the cloud is serviced by somewhere around 360,000 kilometers of cable that runs around the world right now, much of it undersea and much of it tapped. This is another document from the Snowden Archive that talks about, or that shows who the approved signals intelligence partners of the NSA are. So we see it's the Five Eyes or second parties, people with whom they share intelligence with, data with on a very everyday basis, but also a pretty big set of coalitions and third parties. So intelligence isn't just a North American and European thing. It is pretty worldwide. Some other interesting, I guess, dramatic intelligence programs are Fairview. This one is fascinating because it didn't just come out of the Snowden documents. It was a story that was broken by the New York Times in August 2015. No, the story broke in 2015. But I mean, the Times published a story in 2015 about it.
They published an early one in 2005.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
And then Mark Klein exposed their program that one was wiretapping in 2006. So we'd known about that program, but not nearly as much as the New York Times.
So this New York Times article made use of the Snowden documents, and in analyzing what was happening with sifting through documents, and one of these journalists realized that, I remember that a fiber optic cable breaking off the coast of Africa in this year, something that was described in the Snowden document. This cable they're talking about in this document with this code name, Fairview, is AT&T, because there are not that many cables that would have broken in this year off the coast of Africa. That has to be AT&T, and then gradually revealed that AT&T had provided systematic access to its domestic and international networks to the NSA. And by 2011 had been handing over around or above 1.1 billion domestic within the US cell phone calling records every day. Another intelligence program based in the UK is called Tempora. This one is interesting because it was challenged legally in the UK. In the UK, they have judicial oversight of the intelligence services, unlike in Canada, where we have really no oversight. Tempora is a GCHQ fiber optic interception system, whereby these large cables are directly tapped and data is siphoned off. It was challenged in court in 2014 by Privacy International, based in London. It's also interesting because it was challenged by Privacy International in collaboration with a number of sitting MPs, one former and I think 2 or 3 sitting MPs who said, well, MPs were being surveilled, this isn't right. If this is actual proof of mass surveillance, it means everybody's being surveilled, including opposition parliamentarians, and that shouldn't be legal. In the UK, there was, from the 60s, a long sort of informal agreement whereby opposition MPs would not be surveilled. And when they challenged this in court,
They promised.
yeah, they promised. It was a gentleman's agreement. But when it came down to it and they challenged it in court, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal ruled that, well, actually this was legal because a gentleman's agreement doesn't mean anything in reality. And so legally, everybody can be spied on. Finally, another program, it's called Karma Police, the title taken from a Radiohead song, is a system whereby it's sort of another apparatus of surveillance that sort of, in a way, hijacks a number of well-known and widely used websites around the world. Instead of using, I guess, original or self-built communications infrastructure or tapping into fiber optic cables, they figured out or built a system that sits on top of websites that a lot of us use every day for news or buying T-shirts. To bring it up to a few weeks ago, CBC broke a story, I believe 3 weeks ago, about cell phone spying happening in Ottawa. They're basically called Stingrays, also known as IMSI catchers. These devices they've been used widely around for maybe the last 15 or 20 years in North America, but also elsewhere. They're basically fake cell phone towers that trick people's cell phones into connecting to them. Originally, they were used to, say, find somebody who was on the lam from a drug charge and to physically locate where they were to pick them up on a warrant. But increasingly, they're used to spy on people's data. More sophisticated models today can intercept your data, your voice calls, but also at the same time patch you through to your provider. So similar to the way that fiber optic cables are tapped, this is sort of a tapping of people's cell phones. So you don't realize it's happening because you're still communicating. And one of the interesting things about this CBC story is that they mapped out around Ottawa where this was happening, and they spoke with the US Embassy, with the Israeli Embassy, with the Russian Embassy, with Public Safety Canada to try and find out who was doing this stuff. And they all said, it's not us, including Public Safety Canada. And the I guess, ministry that oversees our intelligence services said, well, we're not the ones doing the spying, and we don't know who is. And somehow we're not the ones who picked up on this, CBC did. Which brings me to the final part of the talk on watching the watchers. What does this mean? How do we surveil people who are surveilling? Or how do we, for me, today I was thinking about it as sort of more poking the beast. How do you sort of map out the contours of the surveillance apparatus, this thing that's supposed to be hidden, but occasionally emerges to show itself? And Andrew's done quite a bit of work on this. One project, Surveillance Rights, my colleague Jonathan Obar here, who's at Youre at the Kiel campus, has had one of his classes this year working on documenting the use of surveillance cameras around York and seeing whether these cameras are adhering to the Privacy Act and are being used legally. There's also Andrew's project, which Jim mentioned, called IXMaps, for starting to map out exactly how Canadian internet traffic is routed around the world and how it's routed through the US, where it's being spied on, or is where it's being spied upon in the US. Then there's the Snowden Archive-in-a-Box, and this is a project that I built so that people can do research on the Snowden files without being surveilled. I love the idea of an online archive, but in reality, those of us who do research online on surveillance probably wind up on some sort of list of people who do research on surveillance. And so I wanted to create some sort of safe space for students, for researchers, for anybody to be able to do research on these files without winding up on a list. And finally, a few projects of my own. I recently got a bit of funding from Glendon College at York University for a project called Border Probes, where I'm a pretty privileged person. I grew up in the United States. I'm a Canadian immigrant, so I can't be kicked out of either country. I can't be not admitted to either country. And so I decided I want to sort of use this privilege to start to tease out the apparatus. Part of this project is inspired by one of my students in a social media class I taught this year, a 21-year-old Quebecois woman who works as a model and went to New York to work for a few weeks. And when she crossed the US border, her computer was searched, her cell phone was searched, which isn't totally out of the ordinary since Trump came into office. But the thing that really struck me was that they called contacts in her phone to verify her identity. And I thought, if there's this completely innocuous white woman from Quebec City who's being searched as she goes across the border, what's happening to millions of other people? And to put it in perspective, every year, last year, there were 75 million crossings between the US and Canada by air and over the physical border. The US Bureau of Transportation provides amazing statistics on people crossing the border. Another part of this project is also traveling with the Snowden Archive. I've done this in Europe a bit, but I want to do installations with it in the US. I have a project in the works at Niagara University in Niagara, but also at UCLA and USC, to be very public about this thing in the US and see how it's reacted to. In Europe, I've been spied on a bit, but never really overtly. So more traveling with this thing, but also another project on Stingray catchers. Technology similar to what CBC used to start to map out what's happening in Ottawa with the use of Stingrays. The project I'm developing with a colleague at Concordia University, Fenwick McKelvey, where we want to build our own or use models of Stingray catchers, or IMSI catchers, to start to map out how this apparatus works in Canada. Are these things used in airports, for instance? When you drive across the US border, is your cell phone being surveilled? These things that nobody knows, but maybe we can figure out. And finally, maybe something that Brenda could get into a bit is the holy grail of legislative institutional reform, because trying to figure out how things work is one thing. Actually having a say in how they work, having actual oversight, having transparency and accountability built into a government apparatus is completely different. And finally, if I can get a quick volunteer from the audience to open up this thing and look at what's inside and show people. Has anybody been using it? Stefan? And you too? Would you like to come and open it and see what's inside? It doesn't bite.
There's no snake. The snakes are outside.
Anybody else? Sure. So this is, inside this box is the Snowden Archive, but also a Wi-Fi sniffer that's recording and playing back the conversation between people's devices. And
in the room?
Yeah, once you've connected to the Snowden Archive hotspot, but it's the same as using the internet, but it's showing you what happens when you use the internet. And
I don't want to break it. If you want to
here,
just
I can,
the whole thing.
yeah.
So that's all your data flashes on. You want to show them what's inside
Sure. It's not actually recording anything. I could if I wanted to, and then analyze it later and figure out who's actually doing what. Because your cell phones are all pumping out information all the time, saying, I want to connect to my bank, I want my email, I'm this whatever kind of app, and sending it to whatever it thinks is the internet. So all this information, if you're connected to the Snowden Archive hotspot, your information is going here. If you're connected to Rogers or to the Ryerson Wi-Fi, your information is going there. And it's the same exact thing. So this is what's inside. 2 Raspberry Pi computers that cost about $50 each. And a couple batteries, which are the most expensive and heaviest part of the whole setup. And if you'd like to build your own, just email me. I provide the image online. Maybe about 6 months ago, people were downloading it so often that Dropbox cut me off. I didn't realize they did this until I got an email saying we've cut off your public links for a week.
What makes it an archive?
Well, the interface. So this, I mean, the visual playback has nothing to do with it being an archive. But when you connect to it, you'll see, you can go to it here. This is the Snowden Archive.
So he's connected on the internet now. So
No, I'm not. Right now I'm connected to that box.
that.
Yeah.
Do you have insurance?
What do you mean?
Insurance for
What-
the box?
No, I don't.
This is the box he built for the center, so it's now our box.
So it's an archive in that it's things have been parsed by research assistants, and you can search by security classification, distribution, et cetera.
So it's a server.
It's a server. Yeah, it's a Wi-Fi server and web server, and an archive server.
Andrew, could you just mention what the archive does?
Yeah, well, we built the original archive using software, open source software called Greenstone, which is a digital library software, really available, been around for some time. And what we did, and it's not actually me, but George Rain, who's not here, and Gillian Harkness, they took the Snowden documents and then they coded them. They're trained archivists, they're graduate archivists, and so they created an archival standards record for each document and also the news report where those documents were first released. And so it's basically a database. This Greenstone provides a database of all of these. And so you can search through the database for, surveillance programs. So Evan mentioned PRISM. You can find all the documents that mention PRISM or that have it in its title. You can look for all the documents that were created by CSE, the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. So we developed it as a research resource that students, journalists, lawyers, anybody who was interested could make their way through this collection of documents. There's there are somewhere between 500 and 1,000, depending on how you count them, documents. So by database standards, it's not huge, but it's complicated to navigate through them because they are found, they're originally published on different media's websites. So The Guardian, the Washington Post, and New York Times, Der Spiegel, there's like 30 different media outlets around the world. So we've basically collated those so that you could look in one place. And that's what we tried to do, was to make it a resource that anybody could use. And Evan took that, put it on his magic little box, and can make it available to anybody who wants it in their pocket or in their own library, so that the traffic that would normally be going to our web server, which is in Canada here, it's near Montreal, would not go through the internet, because anything that goes through the internet is susceptible to this interception that Evan's been talking about. So it's kind of, it's another way of getting at that, but without revealing your tracks, unless somebody in this room is using something like this and is actually recording this, and so you may be at risk, but it's a much less much smaller risk.
And it has some practical importance. When the archive was first developed by Andrew and his colleagues, the question was where was it going to be hosted? So we explored hosting it at Ryerson and also the Canadian Journals for Free Expression.
Yeah.
Both organizations were concerned about the legality of it and whether we can be charged with dealing in stolen goods,
Yeah.
which we could,
Yeah.
actually. And Ryerson at the end declined not to host it because they were concerned that if students were using it and they were being tracked, the students could inadvertently become people of interest to security agencies and whatever. So Canadian Journals for Free Expression is hosting it. But with this, we can have it so students or anyone else can search the archive and be invisible to the outside world. I mean, that's really what the Snowden Archive-in-a-Box does. So any of you who are on it right now, unless there's a Stingray in the room or something, can interact, can search the archives. You know, you can search for CSIS and find every document that makes reference to CSIS or whatever you want to search. This is a way you can have access with essentially no fear of being surveilled.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, CJFE is hosting it or Ryerson's hosting it, and the other organization was?
No, so CJFE, the Canadian Journals for Free Expression, is hosting the Snowden Archive. So if you go, if you Google Snowden Archive, it'll take, you can just go straight to the archive and do all the searching you want, but it's on the internet and therefore you can be tracked.
Right. When we first developed it, the web version, leaving aside the version in the box, I approached a number of universities, Ryerson, most notably my own University of Toronto, Queen's University, a number of others, to see whether they would host that, or the archive, in a sort of mirrored way, because we wanted to sort of spread this out. But we repeatedly got concerns from senior university administration that they were nervous about this because they thought it might put them at risk for hosting what could be argued, and there was a legal opinion that CGFE got about this, that these are our legal documents. I was hosting it initially myself, but I didn't think that I was running a lot of risk here, given that all of those documents can be found now in multiple places, and anybody can access them. So I took a bit of a dim view of the nervousness of our institutions about touching this because of that slight risk. CGFE was prepared to take that risk, in part because they thought, and I don't want to speak for them, but they thought that it was very unlikely that they would, somebody would come after them and make us a big story about it because, frankly, I think it would make the agencies look very silly to go after such an agency. But our universities that are devoted to sharing knowledge and being in leadership in this area were reluctant and declined. That, I think, is telling at this time, and that's a great shame.
And the legal opinion we got made very clear that, yes, technically you can be deemed to be in violation of the law, but all the documents there are documents that have otherwise been, remember, Snowden gave them to journalists who then decided what to publish and make available. So they're all the documents in there have been published, and they haven't gone after the New York Times or Der Spiegel or others. So the likelihood of going after a university that was hosting what's already in the public domain is a pretty remote possibility.
There's one caveat where in late September 2014, Barton Gellman from the Washington Post was giving a talk at Purdue University. And it was a big keynote organized by the president of the university. And he used 3 slides of the Snowden documents in a 90-minute talk. And the next day, video was erased of the talk, all advertising was erased. Any sign that this thing had taken place was gotten rid of. And they stopped returning his emails, his phone calls, and it turned out that Purdue gets several $millions of defense funding research money every year. And he put out a story a couple days later explaining what had happened once he figured it out, publishing the contract, the guidelines that Purdue would have to adhere by in order to get this money, and practices by which they handle classified information. And so at the end of this talk, a number of people had gotten up saying, this is still classified, this is still classified. Several people. And so, and right after this, I was giving a talk at Cambridge University in the UK, and I thought, well, Cambridge must have a lot of defense money coming in too. What's going to happen there? And nothing like that happened.
Yeah. Between us, I mean, Evan and I have given talks with many of these slides that he's just shown and many others, dozens of times, I would say, in a variety of places, and we've never had a kind of interference. But the Purdue case is, I think, a chilling indication of the connections here.
What was interesting in talking with some of the universities in Ryerson's case, the concern was simply about if Ryerson was hosting it, and was that implicitly encouraging Ryerson students to use it and could put students in jeopardy? So the university president was very clear that the Center for Free Expression could do whatever it wanted with this, with Ryerson's blessing. And in fact, we had the release the day that we went public about the Snowden Archive. We did it at an event in this room and had a live teleconference with Edward Snowden. So there was no concern on the part of the university doing all those things. In Ryerson's case, it was simply around this notion, are we putting students potentially at jeopardy? Now we can say, well, we'll install this in the library so students can have full access and no student will be in jeopardy.
Yeah, so this is our way around that initial problem, and we hope that all of you will want to take one home with you or get your organization to host one, or maybe some of you.
You're talking about this as if the archive is of articles published based on the Snowden documents rather than the trove that he released himself. Is that the case?
It's the actual documents or copies of the actual documents, the ones that have been subsequently published, and some of them are redacted in various places by the media that published them. So
It's a public record in a sense.
yes, it's on the public record. Yeah, his trove that he handed over to the journalists Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald and Ewan McCaskill in June of 2013 is estimated to be between 58,000 and a million or something. We don't know, but he claims that he handed them all over to those three journalists, and he doesn't have them. The ones that we have in this are simply the ones that have subsequently appeared in the open media, and there's some pressure on these journalists to release more of them. But there's also a lot of work that goes into that because they have to vet them, and they share those documents with the agencies concerned, and they indicate the redactions, and then then the media decides what they're going to publish.
And interestingly, some media that run stories on the same Snowden documents redact them differently.
Yeah.
So some redact very little, and some redact a lot. And that's an interesting thing for any of you who are journalism students looking into who does what and who decides what the public can see and who decides differently about them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting research that can be done using this, and the advantage of the archive is, well, all these things are in the public domain, they're scattered around, so if you wanted to see them, you'd have to see what you could get from the Washington Post and from the New York Times and from CBC and Der Spiegel. Here they're all in one place where you can just put in a search term, CSIS, and get every single document that makes reference to CSIS.
So as new articles are published, do you add them to the archive?
We try to, yes. I think we're up to the end of 2016. There's been 2 releases, I think, this year, in 2017. It's a trickle now, as opposed to a gusher in 2013.
Anyways, could we go on and have Andrew give his comments on Evan's speech, and then Brenda, then Andrew?
Whatever you want.
Whichever way you guys decide, and then we'll move into discussion format.
Well, I've been talking for a while.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Okay.
Do you want to move your computer down?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Jim, and for inviting me. Jim mentioned in my introduction that I relatively recently, did a PhD at U of T. He didn't mention that Andrew was my thesis supervisor. So I'm getting a real kick out of having been invited to be on a panel with him. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, for those of you who don't know, is a nonprofit and non-governmental civil liberties organization that works nationally to defend Canadians' charter-protected rights. And we do that in court. We do that through advocacy at a policy level. We do some original research, which is why I was excited to go as a researcher to take part. And we do a lot of public outreach in education programs in schools, ranging from elementary to high schools to university level teachers, teaching the teachers. About 10,000 students a year we come into contact with, as well as taking every opportunity when we get invited to awesome events like this to come out and talk. So Evan gave us a lot to think about in relation to who's watching us and how they're doing it, and the complexity of the sort of interconnecting private and public networks that facilitate mass surveillance. I'm going to take a slightly different approach from the sort of public advocacy perspective, I guess, and talk about the effects of that kind of surveillance, what we see as a civil liberties group, what people are telling us they're worried about, what they care about, and why we would argue that it matters. So we have a public inquiries program. We get calls, we get emails, we get letters even sometimes. Actually, often the people most concerned with surveillance are the ones who send the letters, as opposed to using an electronic means of communication. And they ask us questions about their rights, or they air their concerns, things that they think are going wrong in Canadian society. We recently did an inventory of those inquiries, and in the privacy area, by far the highest number of questions we had, or concerns that were expressed, were from people who are afraid of unconstrained government surveillance. Sometimes when they talk about government, they mean national security forces of the kind that Evan was referring to, CSIS and CSE in Canada, NSA in the States. Sometimes they're more concerned with public safety, local law enforcement, RCMP, OPP, policing generally. And sometimes they're worried about the sort of blurring boundaries between private sector organizations giving personal information to governments. But the common thread that runs through it is sort of fear about just the sheer scope and range of information that governments are increasingly able to collect about individuals. The questions that we get range, but they kind of boil down to two. I'm going to share them, and it's not complex, it's not rocket science, and then make some connections to the themes that Evan started to pull out and that I know Andrew will be then bringing out again in his chat. The most common question we get is a variation on, how do I know if someone is watching me? And you've basically just heard the answer from Evan. You probably won't know, but you should assume that you are being watched, that your data in some form is being collected if you interact with any online platform. Whether it's being looked at is another question, and we could talk about that. But the reality is, if you participate in online life, your data is at some point being collected in one of these surveillance programs. And obviously, that's not a very reassuring answer to be able to give to people. I'm not going to sort of justify anything, I'm not going to describe how we try to answer that. It depends a lot on specifics. But I think what's interesting to look at here is why we should be concerned as Canadians, as humans, that so many people are asking a civil liberties group a variant of that question. How do I know if someone's watching? It's kind of a simple premise, but it's supported by a lot of scholarship in psychology and organizational behavior and anthropology and other disciplines, that when we're watched, we behave differently than when we're not being watched. And the difference in behavior is not just about being good, which begs the question of what's good and who gets to define good, but it's about being actively afraid to transgress, which makes us afraid to explore and to learn, to fight, to disagree, to be, active humans. We talk about surveillance a lot in terms of privacy rights, and obviously that's a huge overriding concern when it comes to surveillance. But because we're here at the Center for Free Expression, I also wanted to make it clear that privacy is not the only right that gets engaged in relation to this kind of surveillance. Government surveillance has the potential to affect a wide range of rights and freedoms that are protected in Canada by our charter, and potentially jeopardize many of our deeply held democratic values as well. Pervasive surveillance creates a climate of insecurity that has the potential to discriminate, to prevent people from participating democratically. It can curtail peaceful assembly. It can chill freedom of expression, freedom of religious expression, freedom of speech, potentially freedom of the press. And there have been stories in the press recently on all of these topics that show that the surveillance is happening and that it's having an effect. So you'll remember the stories about surveillance of journalists, for example. It's an ongoing issue in Canada. Intellectual freedom is essentially the lifeblood of democracy. We have to have the right to explore ideas, even unpopular ones, try them on, embrace them, or discard them in order to participate in social and political life. And it's hard to do that without self-censorship and without fear if we feel like we're being watched. There's all kinds of research in this area, as I mentioned, but in keeping with my focus on sort of public inquiries and concerns, I'm just going to share a story that happened to me through CCLA in my work. I had the pleasure of working with a group of York University students last year on an experiential learning course where they learned a little bit about our work, and then they did a project that would help us with it. And the two topics that I pitched to them were research about surveillance of dissent, so the idea that when you're engaging in, constitutionally protected disagreement with governments, that you might be watched, and around the Bill C-51, now the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015, which included, among other things, an expansion of CSIS powers, so they're now allowed to engage in disruptive activities. About 3 weeks into the students starting their respective projects, I got an anxious call from the professor. And she said, the students have come to me and they're really concerned that maybe they should stop the project. These are the C-51 students. They've read the bill, they've started to look at the commentary, they've decided that they want to be critical of it, they don't really like it, but they've also figured out what it contains. And it contains that ability for expanded powers for those who are potentially surveilling. And they're actually afraid that if they do this work and if they publish it online, which was part of the project, that it's going to attract CSIS attention to them. That was the first concern. A little bit further on in the process, the students who are engaged in the Surveillance of Dissent project gave me a call. And they said, can you suggest to us some groups to talk to? We want to talk to environmental groups and do qualitative interviews with them to find out if they've experienced surveillance and what their perceptions of it are. And so I gave them some ideas, and they said, no, not those ideas. We've already done that. We've gone to talk to them. And there was a couple. And they've both said no. And I said, oh, they don't. And I said, why did they say no? Do they not have time for students? Are they? Like, no, they said no because they know they're being surveilled, and they said they need to keep their heads down. They don't want to attract additional attention to themselves. And even for a student project, they didn't want to participate in a conversation about what they knew about how they were being watched because they were afraid that would cause more watching or potentially cause repercussions. So think about that for just a second. University students doing research, developing opinions, developing political positions, exactly what they should be doing in a university, are afraid to make them public in case someone starts watching them as a result. Volunteers and staff for established, respected, charitable organizations in Canada are scared to talk about surveillance in the context of their work, even with students. That's a microcosm of what chill looks like in the context of free expression and intellectual freedom, directly because of fears of surveillance. And the follow-up question that we get when we tell people, yes, of course you're being watched, obviously, what would you say? What can I do? And it's really hard to answer that one, too. The answer, as Evan touched on, is quite fraught. From an advocacy perspective, one of the responses that we often are inclined to give is, well, here, we'll help you figure out some privacy protective tools in order to help you control your sense of safety online. So the Snowden Archive is an awesome example. We talk about things like encryption or VPNs or Tor. But the problem with those kind of responses from a practical perspective, especially in relation to national security surveillance, which we can assume is rather sophisticated, is that they may or may not help depending on your risk profile, your ability to find or evaluate the kind of tools that you choose to use, and particularly your vigilance in using them. But from a more political perspective, and to me the more important problem, is that it places the onus for keeping individuals' privacy safe on them. And what it doesn't, we're saying it's up to you to stake out the private space that you're looking for, rather than addressing the societal onus that we should be taking on for providing that space. So that brings us to the other response, which is political action. Evan mentioned I might go there, and I'm going there. I think, but I would put a caveat on that, and the key to effective political action is getting informed. I don't know how many of you might remember a survey recently published in the Toronto Star as part of a big series on going dark. The argument that increasing use of privacy protective technologies, including encryption, is limiting police ability to conduct investigations. So there was this delightful survey where one of the questions, the question that drives me the most insane, was, do you think that police should be allowed to compel people to decrypt their devices if they get a warrant? And a majority of Canadians actually said yes to that. I think if they'd been asked, do you think they should be allowed to compel decryption, even if it goes against your constitutionally protected right to avoid incriminating yourself, the answers would have been different. But the question was, do you think they should be allowed to do it? And a lot of people thought, yeah, that sounds okay. Police should be able to do investigations as long as they get a warrant. But then the next question, an accompanying question, was, do you use encryption yourself? More than 80% said no. So they're asking people who didn't use the technology, who don't know about it, who probably don't appreciate the role it could play in protecting their own digital security, if they're willing to give up that protection. I don't think that answers like that are good grounds for public policy. But if we want better public policy, we need better public awareness so that we can actually have genuinely informed feedback and debate. And the reality is it's really hard to get information about surveillance, how it's happening and how it's going on. So the ability to get informed links to a need for transparency. We really need transparency. And we shouldn't have to justify a call for disclosure. Keeping secrets about the kinds of tools that are being used with public funds to watch citizens in our country is what should have to be justified. Excuses such as impeding investigations or forced security minimally require some elaboration. And then, since there are certainly limits to the amount of transparency we can expect and the ways that we can use it, we need oversight. We need an assurance that some body or bodies with better access than we have to what's actually happening in the national security regime gets to watch the watchers. And the fact that twice in the last 3 years, CSIS has actually been called to task by the federal court for failing in their duty of candor to the court when asking for warrants allowing them to surveil people tells us that there's a profound need for better watching of the watchers. Even when they go to court to get the warrants, which is supposed to provide us with a sense of trust, that they're following the law, that everything is happening as it should, they're not telling the court what they need to know to make good decisions. That's a problem. So I would argue that if we have better transparency and better oversight, the increase in public trust is not just a benefit to us as citizens, it's a benefit to those who surveil. I've been at talks with law enforcement folk who have actually shaken their finger in my face and said, oh, you privacy advocates, you're getting everybody all riled up. And now they don't want to let us use any of our technology. They think that we're doing bad things, and we only act lawfully, but you're getting them all worked up. And I don't think that, much as it would be nice to take credit for rallying people up, that we're doing that. I think that people are perfectly capable of looking at what's happening. And Stingrays, as Evan mentioned, is a fantastic example. They find out that police are using a device that captures the information of thousands of people to track one. And they say, huh? The question we get all the time, people call and say, is that legal? And of course the answer is yeah, kind of. But maybe it shouldn't be. What do you think? there's a disjunction between what people think should be happening in a democratic society and what isn't. And if we want social license, then we need to start thinking about how can we address this? How can we enforce the laws that we have? And what kinds of new laws might we need that would allow the kinds of transparency and oversight and constrain the uses of technology in ways that are appropriate to make sure that the societal values that we share are sort of implemented as part of our security strategy. I'm going to stop there. Oh, whoops, sorry, one little blip. I had brought just a very few of these, and they vanished. If anyone who didn't get one wants one, it's available on the CCLA website as a downloadable PDF, or you can come and talk to me afterwards, and I can figure out how to get you one.
Questions for Brenda?
Why don't you do yours, then we'll do questions.
Okay. Mind if I just stay here, if that's good? Okay, well, thank you, Jim and Angie, and for this opportunity and for you to come to this session. I hope you're not getting too depressed. I'm afraid that I might add a little bit to that, but I also seek to sort of rouse you, perhaps, because I guess you might summarize what I'm going to say as transparency is essential. We've heard that, but it is far from sufficient. And I began, I guess, this sort of, I'd say, a jag towards transparency research following 9/11 and the horror of that event, and how that horror was compounded by the reaction by our governments, principally, who were taking measures that evidently were not likely to be effective, but certainly had other effects on us, notably the kinds of chilling, the security theater, the absence of I would say, a sensible and informed debate about what constitutes threat, what constitutes suitable measures to deal with the real threats, the pressure that's been put on civil liberties as a result of those measures. The trade-off between security and privacy was constantly mentioned, and without any evidence of the need for those particular security measures, which were often, as I say, security theater, and didn't contribute significantly to safety, but certainly did impinge in various ways on liberties and the rights and sort of democratic freedoms that we depend on. So this was a major provocation for me, and I began probing through, I'm a computer scientist by background, so developing sort of technical probes to better understand how surveillance was being done, to render it more publicly visible. And often, typically, surveillance is invisible. It's in the wires, it's in the ether, it's behind the walls, and so on. And of course, a lot of it is secret and adamantly so. And you've just heard from Brenda some of the whiff of that kind of protection that the security agencies deal with. Any kind of information about what they are doing, even things that clearly would not compromise current investigations or which might be legitimate, but not even basic information. Look at the struggle that they've had to even make public the fact that they are using these IMSI captures, which I think is telling. So I began this work on transparency probes, first of all with ID cards. Brenda mentioned that and was very helpful in some of those projects, around video surveillance of a smartphone app that allows you to record the video surveillance installations and have it rated against the legal requirements just for signage. And our initial studies showed that there was, at least in terms of commercial video surveillance installations, we could not find any that met the minimum requirements under the appropriate law. It's called PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act. And then subsequently, I offered a $100 reward. This was now, how many years ago? 6? Is it?
7.
6 or 7 years ago. Well publicized, $100 to the first documented case of a legal, at least in terms of signage, regardless of what else happens behind that. And I still have the $100 in my back pocket. If any of you want to make some money, you might try and find one. Across the road, you will see at the atrium one that's very close, and that's because we talked to them, and that one is the only one that has actually picked up our offer to design a sign for them for free so they could be compliant. This is very telling, I think. And then, of course, when Snowden's revelations started spilling out, and many of the fears that we had about the ways in which our security agencies, particularly signal intelligence agencies, had worked their interception, their spying apparatus into the very fabric of the internet, which we depend on. Those became clearer, and I think many of us were astonished by the scope and the extent of that. We knew things were going on from other revelations, but it's really quite remarkable that there is no doubt that there is a global apparatus for electronic interception that is comprehensive in its scope, and that is, it produces, an ongoing detailed record, and it is being used for a multiple of purposes, not just for anti-terrorism, but for, state negotiations, trade negotiations, even as simple as things like clove cigarettes and shrimp trading with Indonesia. And in the case of Brazil, a Canadian agency tapped in to help with the negotiation around a buyout of a Canadian mining firm, the tracking of dissenters, and so on. So we're at a situation now where we cannot be innocent about the actions of our democratically elected, presumably democratically governed apparatus for security. And there's clear evidence that they are acting unconstitutionally in many cases, illegally certainly, or at least under extremely shady definitions of what the law says, and there's a consistent attempt to resist any a consistent response to any attempts to hold them to account for that. So what I'm concerned with is that over this period of time, while so much has come out, that we are so much better informed, so the actual legal apparatus that we're operating under due to recent legislation, notwithstanding a little bit of rollback in the United States in a very narrow area around metadata records, is worse. And there's every indication that the actual apparatus and the scope of the activities of these agencies has continued to expand, and that much of the legislative initiatives are to make legal or more legal the activities that were ongoing activities that were previously illegal. So this the situation has challenged my sort of hopes or naive assumptions about the role of transparency. The idea of transparency is that once people know that something's going wrong, then it becomes corrected. And we certainly saw this chilling effect in Brenda's remarks. It's sort of the basis for much of video surveillance installations, even the fake ones, you'll behave better. Turns out, actually, that it's not really the case in many ways, particularly if you're a powerful actor. And by now, we've seen many examples of agencies, even before Trump, who, when called out, would not act. And now, I think, Trump, in a way, personifies the kind of unfettering of the statements of sort of what we might think are, should be treated as truths, as things that are shocking and that so offend the public conscience that you couldn't get away with it, but it is now a matter of we witness this daily. And so my concern about transparency and a move to transparency is that if you know something that's wrong that you think is shocking, and you're not able to do anything about it, and you don't do anything about it, then you de facto accept it, right? It becomes the norm, the sort of the measures by what we constitute it's gone too far, have shifted remarkably. And so in the wake of Snowden, can we imagine what kind of revelations about the activities of our state agencies in terms of their encroachment into our data lives it would take before there was a real rollback? It's hard for me to imagine that. Certainly there has been stimulated a debate, but the debate, to me, shows that our institutions, the laws, the oversight bodies, the privacy commissions, the parliaments, the courts, are not up to the task for dealing with this, to put the genie back in the bottle, that we now see that we have deep state institutions that are unfettered by the law and can act with impunity. That is extremely dangerous, I would say. And unless something is done soon, we're going to live in extremely threatening world. And we can see these almost daily encroaching. And so that worries me, that by being transparent, by promoting transparency, we are now actually promoting a kind of acceptance of this norm. I was recently at a talk by Grand Chief Stuart Phillips, who's an Aboriginal leader in British Columbia, a remarkable individual. He was talking about environmental protection. Kinder Morgan pipeline is a big issue out in BC where I live. Reconciliation between settler and colonial communities, healing, and so on. And he said that what inspired him, in part, was what he imagined was an admonishment from his grandchildren, who would say to him, "You knew everything, but you did nothing." Well, this fellow is not doing nothing. He's doing more than almost anybody I can think of. Or perhaps more gently, it might have been, "You knew everything, but you did too little." And I feel that myself, because having studied this, I think a lot about it. And I am extremely concerned the way, the direction things are going. And I don't think that being transparent is going to be enough unless people take what they learn and do something substantive with it. Now, that's a really hard problem. How does social change happen? How do we affect changes to institutions that are invisible, very recalcitrant, and for some good reasons? It's going to take a major change of awareness and activity in social movements at this point. Our privacy commissioner, while they do an important job, I feel is not up for the task. Your mention about the budgets of the oversight bodies for these large organizations and the fact that they were not their duty to what did you call it, duty
of candor.
Candor, right? They are pretty much off the leash, I would say. I'm not saying that they're all evil-minded people. They're for the most part, people like us, think they're doing the job. But we've got plenty of examples in history where well-meaning people within within I'd say, pathological organizations can do terrible things. So we're in kind of a difficult situation here. And so I am myself wondering about this, what to do sort of beyond transparency. And I will continue to do these initiatives, and I think that the Snowden Archive is great, and I'm all for getting it in other places, and I hope every institution, will, particularly where they have a good reason, and even not for a good reason, just as a sign of resistance. We don't go along with this regime. It's a mild act of resistance. If you can, if you're protected enough. I'm retired now. I was a tenured professor. I don't feel that I'm nearly as vulnerable as students and many of others about this. But to the degree that you can act with relative safety, I would suggest that you think about what kinds of actions, forms of resistance you can take. I could say a lot more, but I guess we're running out of time here. So I'll just make a couple of very, very brief plugs, and if people want to stick around, I'd be glad to elaborate on them or have a wider discussion. First of all, kind of dig where you stand. Scratch your own itch. We're sitting in a university that has outsourced its email and communication services to Google several years ago. The students' email, anyway. I don't know if it's faculty outsourced here.
They, because of the pressure we put on, they agreed to keep the traditional service, but also Google. So you have a choice of a sort of broken down, which I choose,
right,
or a really good service, which is Google.
Right. Yes.
And when I came here, I had that choice, and I may have been the first person who ever chose the broken down service. Yeah. They looked at me as like I was from Mars.
Yeah, and they don't. I looked at my daughter graduated from here, and I looked at the options, and it's Google by default, and you have to.
I mean, Ryerson was one of the few universities that maintained faculty having a choice.
Yeah, and you had a debate about it. You had a public debate about it, which is
great. Yeah, and they've
great.
organized a day-long public debate before doing anything. Alberta, Lakehead, a whole bunch of Canadian universities jumped into Google's embrace, because what Google was offering cash-strapped universities is you're spending a couple $1 million a year in your email system and your digital record system. We'll take it over and provide it all to you for free.
For an indefinite period of time.
For an indefinite, it was for a contractually limited period of time.
Right, but not for an indefinite.
But then they had all the data on the thousands and thousands of people in universities, so they could market stuff. There's a lot of advantages. And we had a devil of a time. I spent 7 years as the executive director of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, traveling the country trying to persuade universities not to do this. And it wasn't just the administrations, it was our colleagues who often said, well, I've got nothing to hide. Or, look, there's no way we can be safe anyway, so what's the difference?
Yeah.
So
at U of T, they had gone to Microsoft, and the student system had moved over a couple of years ago, and it came time for the faculty. Myself and a number of colleagues, particularly Lisa Austin in law, who was on the consultation committee, we basically stopped that move. We held it up for 3 years, and 2 weeks ago, they announced that they're going with Microsoft, but this is after they had, Microsoft had installed the servers in Canada. And this is, Jim has already given me the look.
where the servers are doesn't make a difference.
Where it doesn't?
Does not make a difference.
Well, I disagree a little bit. It does matter in terms of constitutional jurisdiction. And if you believe the Constitution still matters, and I hope we all do, to at least to some degree, then it does matter whether it's on Canadian soil. The fact that it's Microsoft Canada also helps a little bit, but I would say the issue is far from settled.
Well,
but it was the pressure from us and quite a number of others that Microsoft has, I believe, has moved its servers because they were getting a huge amount of heat after Snowden. because their business model was threatened.
But the USA Patriot Act requires any, and the term is US-linked corporation, to turn over whatever data is requested by the appropriate agencies. So whether it's a subsidiary or, there's some legal cases going on where they're trying to sort this out, but the plain reading of the legislation says that if Microsoft is asked by the FBI to turn over information to Andrew Clement that's on their server in Canada, they're obligated to do it. And Andrew's absolutely right. There's charter protections, there's Canadian law, but the requests from the FBI or the CIA, of course, are secret. And so is Microsoft going to say to the CIA in a discussion that nobody knows about, well, there's Ontario law, there's Canadian law that says we can't do that, so we're not giving it to you. Now, I'm just not one who believes that they're going to say that.
Yeah. Well, they have taken some very high-profile court cases, and they have stuck in their heels. But I'm with you most of the way. And
I mean, that's a worry. And I mean,
it should stay on campus. Almost half of intra-campus, half of email on campus is intra-campus. I mean, it doesn't have to go outside. I take that as a small victory. I want to look for encouragement where you can find it so that you can keep going. Not to say that you've solved the problem, because it's a much faster one, but it's an example of things that can happen if you press and if you stand up and if you're not afraid. And I think there's a lot more things like that. So I just picked that as an example because we're sitting right here in this place.
Should we provide an opportunity for people to ask you questions? Why don't we do that? Ange has a microphone so that you're captured in the recording. So did I see a hand back there? Yes, the woman in the yellow sweater. Is the microphone on? Try again.
Hello?
Yep,
Okay.
now we're good.
Sorry. With regard to the cloud that was mentioned earlier, I'm just wondering if the physical server is in X or Y country, would that govern how the cloud is used or how privacy is legislated for that particular cloud?
Who would like to answer that?
Well, I think I can. I mean, yes, it should. I mean, as we were just discussing, the physical location does determine jurisdiction. So that data that is in Canada is covered, by the Canadian Constitution and Canadian laws. Now, they're not always work quite the way they should, but that does matter. Jim's point about it being, subsidiary of a U.S. company that is subject then to U.S. law does mess things up. So it's a bit murkier. But yes, location does affect jurisdiction. The other side to that is how you get to that server, and this is the thing that I'm doing with this IXMaps research, is showing that a lot of our traffic, even traffic between Toronto and Toronto, goes via the US. So it can be intercepted, and well, it is intercepted on the way. So
well, they could go to your website, couldn't they? The IXMaps.
Yeah.
So give them the website where they track. I mean, Andrew would send an email to the Student Association across the street.
Yeah, it was OSAP, the
Student Assistance Program,
right.
Which was, what, a couple blocks from your office?
Yes, it's across Queen's Park.
And where did it go?
To New York and Chicago.
On the route.
Right. And it's been doing that for years. We've been tracking it.
But there's another factor in addition to the location, and that's the status of your records that are on the server. There are some cloud services that are wholly encrypted. That it's encrypted on your computer, it goes into the cloud, it's encrypted on the server in the cloud, so even if the NSA gets it, what they're getting is an encrypted document that the host of the server doesn't have the key to.
So like our medical records, for example, would be part of that.
Hopefully, they should be, yes.
Yeah, well, medical records is interesting because in BC, they passed a law based on medical records, actually, because they're routinely stored in the U.S., that information that's under the jurisdiction of the BC government has to stay within Canada. No other province has that. And the Medical Insurance Bureau, as far as I know, still based in Boston, still has all of your medical records for the purposes of insurance.
And
So it's going outside the country, and the NSA certainly will have access to that.
some of the major American research universities that went to Google prohibited the use of the Google service for any medical for any records related to patient care in their medical schools for that very reason. Other questions? Yes, over here.
Sure. Yeah, and one additional consideration would be where it replicates to for fault tolerance. It could start out at one place and then it ends up in another country. But my question is, for any of the four of you, have you heard anything about a legal motion towards the definition of unauthorized encryption? Because that scares the hell out of me, and I think, keep your ears open.
Unauthorized encryption.
Yeah.
Anybody here have heard of unauthorized encryption?
Like a contraband, as in, you need authorization to encrypt your traffic. If it's not part of approved corporation, association, et cetera, you can't encrypt. That worries me.
Sorry, do you want to pass them the mic? Go ahead and comment.
You did.
Well, I'm surprised, maybe I'm wrong, but there was a law project in the UK about forbidding some level of encryption a few years ago. I think, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, David Cameron famously said when he was Prime Minister, that there should be no no-go areas in terms of your data. I'm not familiar with the term unauthorized encryption as such, but there has been an ongoing battle around the use of encryption that goes back to the 1990s. It was called the Clipper chip debate, among others. And the encryption software, RSA standard software, was, the pretty good privacy, should I say, PGP, that was developed by Zimmerman, was declared a weapons-grade product software, and he faced charges then. This is in the 1990s. Now that debate is being reinvigorated, and so they are trying to, these signal intelligence agencies are trying to get around encryption, and they do it in various ways, partly through legal means, partly by getting software onto your machine so that they can get it before that. They've weakened the standards by getting involved with the organizations that set the encryption standards to make it so easier for them to backdoors, all kinds of things.
Yes.
Have there been any cases where the Canadian government or the Privacy Commissioner or anybody responsible for the privacy of people inside Canada have actually taken a corporation or another government or entity to court to fight for the privacy rights of Canadians? And the other small question I wanted to ask is, how do we shift that onus from privacy protection from the individual, how they're behaving, use Signal or Tor, to legislative or structural changes?
Brenda, do you?
Well, I mean, there are two cases that are happening are being decided right now by the Supreme Court of Canada that have a lot of relevance for privacy rights. One is Duez versus Facebook, and it's a case about...
Mention the first name again.
Duez, D-O-U-E-Z. That's actually a woman's last name. Her first name is Deborah. Deborah Duez versus Facebook. And the case that's being heard right now is actually whether or not Canadians should be allowed to bring a case about their privacy protection in Canada when an internet service provider has a forum clause in their contract that says that you have to bring cases forward in the jurisdiction the company chooses, which in this case it's Google and it's or Facebook and it's California.
Just a footnote there. All of the Google agreements with Canadian universities where they've taken over, provided free email service, has, amongst other clauses, a clause saying that any legal action taken in relation to this, so if they don't turn back your data or whatever, has to be taken, and most of them say, in the state of California, in the county of Santa Clara. Some say in New York. That's the kind of provision that she's talking about.
Yeah. So,
So they're asking the question, is that legal?
So we're in court arguing that Canadians should be able to exercise their rights under Canadian privacy law in a Canadian court. And we're not even at the point where we're going to argue the case that she's actually concerned about, which is Facebook took her image and used it in targeted advertising, and she argues without her consent. Because right now we're arguing, should she be allowed to bring the case forward in a Canadian court? And that argument is now all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. So we're fighting on that front.
You mentioned there was a second case?
The other case is R versus America. And it's a case about whether or not Canadians have privacy rights in their text messages. So it involves a case where when text messages were taken from an individual, so there was a search that was deemed improper. So like the accused in a case, the police were not allowed to search his phone for text messages. But they got the same messages from the recipient's phone, and the use of those messages was allowed. And so there's a case, it was heard at the end of March. The Supreme Court is now deliberating about whether or not we should have rights to privacy in sent text messages, and whether or not it matters, whether it's the technological platform on which we engage in our private communications that should matter, and the way that the technology works that should determine what kind of privacy rights we have, or whether we should be looking at this as a matter of principle and saying a private conversation is a private conversation. So those are two that I know of that CCLA is involved in, where we're fighting around issues of privacy rights for Canadians.
Do you want to mention Pippa's case that took the OPC?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, there was another case several years ago where Pippa Lawson, who was at the time with a group called CIPIC, a Canadian Internet Policy Clinic or something. I got that quite right.
University of Ottawa. So if you Google CIPPIC,
Right.
University of Ottawa.
And so there was a case where she was challenging that what was being done with her data by a US company. She took the complaint to the Office of the Privacy Commission to get to see if they could handle that. They refused. She took them to court, and the federal court ruled that in fact the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, should pursue that. So we had a rather reluctant Privacy Commission at that time in terms of protecting rights, Canadian data rights outside of Canada.
There's also your second question about how we sort of get to political change and infrastructural change. And we originally tried to invite Robert Oliphant, who's the chair of the Standing Committee on National Defense and Security, to be a discussant on this panel. He's also the MP for the riding that Glendon College is in. He was the chair of the committee that had a sort of fly-by-night, week-long Trans-Canada consultation on Bill C-51 back in, November?
Ish.
And he never responded to us. There are 6 members of this committee who are Toronto MPs, and I don't think any of them are here today. So I think it takes serious political change. It takes people in power who understand this technology, who understand the issues at stake. When I've interviewed MPs and asked them if they use encryption or what privacy is, what surveillance means to them, and it seemed like it was the first time anybody had asked them these questions. And these are people who make decisions about the legal frameworks that we work in.
I wouldn't want to underestimate the impact of people feeling, well, it's hopeless. They're going to get us anyway, so let's not even do anything about it. And that's such a destructive approach to take, because then the ball game's over.
Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher, when we were in the 1980s, arguing about free trade agreements that are back in the news now, she went around the world saying, Tina, there is no alternative. In other words, don't bother fighting these things because there's nothing you can do about it. And now that same thinking is embedded in so many people that, well, the powers of the NSA and their capabilities and this technological stuff is beyond my capability, so they're going to get me. I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to pretend it's not happening. And I think that's one of the major impediments to us being able to mobilize people politically to cause the kinds of protections we should have. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Yes, actually, I understand you have spoken about the surveillance program, and I don't know how far you mentioned about. Actually, I am victim, and I would like to mention how far I am affecting more than 6 or 7 years from the previous government to up to now. In my understand the news I can report, I am not a victim in the worldwide. There are a lot of people, specifically the five countries, there are more victims. We are domestic surveillance 24/7, so 24 in all the whole day, right? So we have been targeted, and we are moving everything counted, and not only that, they are exposing microwave like a Pandora war. You know, earlier USA and Russia embassies, Pandora war, you know, everyone know, I don't want to say. But this is one, actually, that there's a scientists are there, science fiction are there. So we can prove, actually there is a proof, we can prove how government have a power, all the devices, intelligence have all the devices and everything, they can do simply. But unfortunately, they are the same type of Galileo, that type of church mission rule, they are denying everything and labeling or delusion. And not only that, even everywhere, the government mechanism, everything, the doctors and everybody, when we go, even that attack or that target, very reddish and pain and swollen. Even when we see the doctors saw, no, that is they are dividing. Even they cannot recommend at least one MRI or tissue damage, or there are, you know, the biological effect of the exposure level of the microwave is a high standard. I have a meter also, EMF, that is proving that the standard of the level of the exposure level. The police, when we call the neighbors, this has been same type of neighbors, the Pandora war neighbors has been, or contractors has been given to expose, and by the remotely, they can remotely, there are a lot of things, but how they do, this is a frequency of the, you know, the type of trader, Wi-Fi trader, and they can be, in my understanding, I read something with my knowledge, and they can be taken like our reflection of the type of sound wave, reflecting wave they can do. This same technology they have used in the earlier, and even the police used the behind the wall. But yeah, well, that can be used, but they are using, I am living in...
So do you have a question for our panelists?
Yes, they are using. Do you have an idea or the knowledge? You are expert and professional, and I believe you have find that this is the server like that, you know, to our data surveillance or something. But the same way, do you able to understand or come to the research, this can be do? I mean, normal people can be, and she was talking about how we realize we are in the surveillance or no, but can this type of technology, they can simply use without our knowledge and can targeted and torture. It's a type of real barbarous torturing every night. Okay, but why we can prove? I mean,
so what is your question for the panel?
The question is, can you able to, at least there are everything silence keeping? Can you able to do bring our voices or something? Yes, is it possible? Because you are the educated people. And
okay. So give them a chance to answer if you want.
Sure. I'm not sure I fully understand your question, and I recognize that a lot of what we're talking about here does sound a bit like science fiction. And it was at one time, but the advances are quite remarkable. But we do need to be able to distinguish between what is actually happening and what is imagined. And I want to say that when I say everybody's being surveilled all the time, that doesn't mean that it's inevitable and that there are no escapes, that there's no way out of it. You have to be in particular physical places. It depends on the particular technologies that you're using, and there are ways of getting around that, both legislatively and technically. I don't want to sort of fuel kind of this what you're concerned about. This fear that we are. It's hopeless that we are all immersed in it all the time. There are things we can do.
Well, like the fight at the University of Toronto to block Microsoft.
Sure.
I mean, whether the solution was ideal or not.
No, it's not an ideal, but yeah, it is
But
something.
engaging in those kinds, or using encryption. When we had the teleconference of Edward Snowden, he said, well, one of the important reasons for more and more people to use encryption is because if the only people who use it are people like me, you're a person, you immediately become a person of interest.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's widespread, it changes the dynamic. And so
Yeah.
there's some advantage to engaging in that by people who may feel they have nothing to hide or no reason to do. And he said there's loads of simple things you can do, like use Signal instead of iMessage, which is a free app you can download, and do all your messaging, and anybody you do it with who's also on Signal is fully encrypted. Or use Proton Mail for your email server. I mean, there's just many things you can do to, or instead of using Dropbox, use SpiderOak or Sync, all encrypted services. And you may feel you never need these things, but there's some advantage in just starting to use them, and that creates discussion with your colleagues about why you're using them and so forth.
Yeah.
Anyways, there's another question?
Sir,
Yes.
can we group the questions, because I know that the teams have to pack up and stuff?
Okay, we're going to have to go. So 2 more questions, and then we'll just end it. So each of you could ask your question, and then the panel will respond to both of you.
Okay. The stories about the Stingrays that have come out the last 2 weeks have been there's been an avalanche of news on that, and I was very surprised to see that the RCMP gave this news conference in which they admitted they had been operating in violation of the Radio Communication Act. I was very surprised to see that, because I had been A-tipping on this issue for a long time, okay?
Right.
So when I saw it, I thought, geez, well, that's, that's good of you to now admit that. But that's not okay, to be violating federal law. It's not just okay to violate federal law and then explain to people, well, you know, that's water under the bridge. What can we do about it?
Okay, so that's one question. What do we do about that? Last question?
Thank you very much. My question is about what we can do too, but I had the opportunity to be in a marketing meeting recently, and I heard this phrase that everybody seemed to agree with, like something obvious. When it's free, the product is you. And I'm surrounded by young people that, well, I'm a little older, so yes, I'm shocked by all these things. I'm used to write letters, but they feel it's completely normal. It's, of course they're being watched, and it's normal, and it's part of their reality. And they even find something quite comfortable, that if they're looking for something the day after, they have an advertisement about this and that, and they feel some kind of safe in a certain way in the system. So how can we turn the tide? Because this new generation know nothing else than that. And I want to be hopeless. No, I don't want to be hopeless. I want to be hopeful. So I want you to give me hope.
I want to thank the last of you for giving the panel the chance to end the evening by talking about what we can do. So do you want to, Brenda, do you want to start? Yeah. And then Andrew, and we'll end with Evan.
Well, I'm going to go on a positive note, because I've actually spent the last year working with a group of young people on a privacy project. We brought together people from around the GTA and Southern Ontario, and one valiant person who would Skype in from BC. And we spent the last year introducing them to privacy researchers, having them learn about the kinds of privacy issues that we have in Canada today, letting them think about it and talk about it. And then they wrote a guidebook of, by teens, for teens, things you should know about your privacy. And it was not, these kids were self-selected, obviously. They chose to come and spend their Saturdays with us at CCLA. But it was absolutely not the case that they didn't care. They do have different ideas. They think about privacy a little bit differently. They don't think it's unusual to be online and to have marketing, for example. But they're really clear on the fact that they want to be able to exercise choice. That if they want it, then that's fine. And if they don't want it, they should be able to turn it off. And they're very concerned with protecting their online reputations and curating the way that they appear online. So they know because they know that they're being watched and they choose to engage in online platforms, they're super conscious of the idea that it matters how they present themselves online. And they take steps to sort of curate their own reputations. So I don't think that it's hopeless in terms of young people and their attitudes towards privacy. I don't think they all are just not worried about it. I think they are navigating a difficult world and developing their own sort of standards and norms around it in ways. But there's definitely still a core, a human core that says there are times when things that I do I should get to choose who gets to see it, if anybody, and that that hasn't changed.
So did the booklet you produced, is that available publicly?
Yeah, that's available publicly at the CCLA website.
So CCLA.org.
CCLA.org.
Okay, Andrew.
Well, the two last questions are the really big ones, right?
That's right.
What do you do when your government acts illegally? And what happens when the future generations have already accepted a certain way of dealing with commercial media that doesn't bother them? I think Brenda's obviously...
So you have a minute to answer both.
Yes, Brenda's done a marvelous job of starting on the second one. But I mean, as for the first one, I mean, I feel that we are in a kind of a new situation here, or those of us who are naive and assume that our governmental institutions are working the way they should and that they don't break the law. And now they do. Now we know they do. And we know that they will try to get away with it. And so, I mean, obviously there's the political measures of holding the government feet to the fire, as we do on all kinds of things. And I mean, that has to be at least the initial one. With organizations like CCLA that have the legal resources, they need support because they are in a position to challenge that, and they have won some important decisions that wouldn't have been challenged, or not important decisions, but for around issues that wouldn't have gone challenged had they not done that. So that's another, I think, big thing that we should all be doing, is to picking your favorite civil society organization that you feel advocates on your behalf. And besides the CCLA, there's the BC Civil Liberties Association. We've mentioned this Canadian Journals for Free Expression, which hosts the Snowden Archive. There's CIPIC that's been mentioned, law organization in Ottawa. There's Open Media that advocates around media issues. They are the organizations that can provide some of the pushback when your parliamentarians don't.
Okay.
Talk to your parliamentarians and support the civil society organizations.
Last word to you.
Sure. I'll speak to both questions because I work on both a lot, and we should totally talk because I've been asking for copies of your ATIPs. For me, I'm curious what the real end game is with Stingrays, because repeatedly in Canada and in the US, there are court cases that are given up on because police forces don't want to divulge how they get information. So if they're not being used to transparently wrap up the mob in Montreal or to prosecute drug cases in the US, what are they being used for? What if no matter what the crime is, or the state's not willing to really divulge its capabilities in court, what is the ultimate end game of this technology? I think that one of the real problems with what do you do when your state does something illegal is how do you punish an institution? The RCMP, I mean, is not parliamentarian. It's extra, not extra statal, but we have these organizations that aren't necessarily accountable. And we don't necessarily have a good model set at the parliamentary level where parliamentarians, to an extent, operate with impunity. And I think that repeatedly, if you have institutions at the high federal level that are willing to work however they want to, then you wind up with the same models being replicated all the way down to cities, which is why the SQ and the Montreal Police Force were caught spying on journalists over around a decade. because the same thing happens federally. To quickly get to Kinty's question on social media, I found myself teaching a class this term at York on social media marketing and advertising. I'm not on social media at all, and so it was an interesting course to come into with a group of mostly 20-somethings who, I'd say the majority of them started using social media between the ages of 5 and 7. They were all on various platforms, but they all wanted a critical course on social media. The majority of them were there because they wanted to know more about how this stuff worked, what's at risk, really the nuts and bolts of how it works, not so that they can market themselves, but so that they can understand better. And so that they can, some of it was they wanted to really, similar to this project that you had going on with teens, they wanted to learn how they can educate newer generations to use social media more wisely. So I think that there is hope. I think that it has to be addressed in a broader way. It can't just be me teaching a class of 25. How many kids were in your project at CCLA?
25.
But the document they're producing is going through the whole Toronto school board system.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so that's, so,
And if I can just,
okay, very quickly,
insert one further response, because it's immediate and it's practical. Bill C-22, which is the creation of parliamentary oversight of these agencies in Canada. For the first time, Canada hasn't had this, is before the Senate right now. It's passed through the Commons. So it's a last, ditch effort to try to strengthen that so that the parliamentarians have actual real oversight powers.
because it's quite a weak bill as drafted.
Yes, it's much weaker than was expected.
That's right.
But the Senate has turned back things before. They have insisted on strengthening things.
So,
And if you
there's a
don't do
variety of
anything
options for you.
Yeah.
One option I'd like you to take right now is to join me in thanking our speakers tonight for a wonderful talk.